I said, Mom, I practice Nichiren Buddhism. What parts of science do I have to ignore in order to practice? And she said, nothing. She said, in fact, Buddhism is ahead of science, and science is trying to catch up.
The fact that we can look to Earth to see how precious our home is also, like the beauty of this endeavor to explore space.
Science is about experimenting. We just don't leave it up to say, oh, it's magical. Neither is the Nichiren Buddhism magic, and nor is science magic. They're all based on actual proof.
And the scientist kind of stepped back and says, well, at that point, you've just entered the realm of philosophy. You need to ask a philosopher. And my head went...
From SGI USA, I'm Cassidy Bradford, and this is Buddhability, the weekly series where I talk with Buddhists from all walks of life about the power we each have to change our lives and the world around us. Welcome, everyone, to Buddhability. We have a very special episode today. For anybody that's watching the version on YouTube, you can see instead of 2 faces, there are 5. So I have 4 really incredible guests today. We're really diving into Buddhism, science and space, and daily life. All of the folks here have experience and work in the field of space and science. So I have shared with them. I am not a STEM person, so I'm really excited to learn a lot more and kind of expand my horizons through dialogue with you guys. We all practice SGI Nichiren Buddhism, so when we're speaking today, we're really speaking from that framework, so just to, keep that in mind. So as a way for all of you guys to just introduce yourselves, I was thinking each of you can just tell me a little bit about who you are, and then as a way to kind of discuss the work that you do, just share how your Buddhist practice really comes to your work and your daily life. So maybe we can start with T, if you want to kick us off.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is T, and right now I live in San Francisco, California. My journey started when I was in elementary school, middle school. I want to be a teacher, and then also I want to be an astronaut. And because of that, that motivates me to study, science, technology, math. And then I decided to come to America in order to pursue higher education on that front. Throughout that journey, somehow my life, changed the direction to the area of data science, finance. And I have been working in that area for 7 years. And around that same time, I encountered SGI Nichiren Buddhism. And then I rediscover my dreams again. Buddhism influenced, my life and my decision. Is actually the idea of when people hear about Buddhism in general, traditional Buddhism, we tend to think about calming my mind, get rid of the desires and so forth. But Nichiren Buddhism actually empower you to fulfill your dreams, as long as that dreams benefit other people, benefit yourself, have beauty. So just pursue it.
Wow, thank you, T. Thank you so much. So maybe now we'll move to Neha. You want to introduce yourself?
Sure, yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Niharika, and I am currently stationed in Cape Canaveral, Florida. I serve in the U.S. Space Force as an active duty military officer, second lieutenant. And I am currently working on missions surrounded with providing government assets into space for national security. I encountered Buddhism in 2011-2012 timeframe through my cousin, and I've just been practicing since then. I have found so many times that, I have used my practice to overcome challenges in personal and professional life. Our roles are always working with people. It's never an individual effort. I constantly have to polish myself, and that's what Buddhism allows you to do. It constantly is telling you how you can work with people alongside, and the challenges that you have in personal life and professional life. How can you turn that into providing for the greater good? As T mentioned, one of the reasons I also started practicing Buddhism is so that I can expand my life. That's what Nichiren Buddhism allows you to do. I never thought I would be in the military, right? But, as Daisaku Ikeda had always mentioned, to constantly expand your life and that you can accomplish anything. That's what empowered me to pursue this dream of mine to serve the country, and also on the same lines, having a fascination for space and, become an astronaut later in the future. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Neha. All right, Roger, you want to go next?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Roger. I work at Patrick Space Force Base, 20 miles south of where NEO works. I work for a defense contractor for the United States Space Force. I was born into this practice, and my mother came here in the 1960s and helped stand the community up here in the United States. I've always been around Nichiren Buddhism, Sokogaku Nichiren Buddhism. It's something that I use every day, especially with Daisaku Ikeda's guidance on being able to work with people. As a contractor, I have to deal with, Niha side of the house. I have to deal with the 45th Space Wing, and I have to deal with contractors. I have to deal with NASA and their projects and stuff. I have to deal with each and every one of these organizations and be able to hear what they want, to accomplish, and then be able, as an engineer, to put forth that, that project or that task to give them what they need. And basically to be able to get these rockets off the ground. I think there's a commercial that used to be on air. We don't make the rockets, but we help, get the rockets off the ground. So that's kind of what we do. We take care of all the hardware on the ground to get these rockets off the ground. People like Neha was saying, the United Space Alliance and all these other organizations, that launch. They're the ones, who get these vehicles into space, and we just make sure that they are able to do that with the ground hardware that we have.
Wow, I just listening to you guys, I was thinking wow, I have so little understanding of everything that goes into just one rocket going into space. Thinking about all of the different kinds of people you have to work with and different skill sets. It's yeah, maybe that's so silly for me to have that realization, but I'm wow, this is serious. I'm really impressed. So Cindy, you wanna introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Cindy, and I support planetary scientists who take data from spacecraft and lead missions across our solar system and literally write the textbooks that people study of planetary science. I'm also a deputy project manager as a contractor to NASA on a NASA mission. My undergrad was in physics and astrophysics, but I wasn't really, I never really wanted to get into physics. I was born into this practice. Like Roger, my mother was practicing this in Japan before she came to the States. And so I was raised practicing this Buddhist philosophy, but also my father was very scientifically minded and would always kind of quiz my brother and I on things like, you see the bubbles in that glass of pop and how they get bigger when they go to the surface. You know why that's happening? And you know why the sky is blue? He would always ask these kinds of questions. And so it made me very curious about how the universe worked. And so when I started college, I kind of wanted to learn more about how the universe worked, but also kind of how Buddhism works, because I knew it worked because I practiced it, but I never really saw the math. And so when I went to school and got my physics undergrad, it was, I remember making so many notes in the margins of my homework about, wow, just like in Buddhism, this concept is consistent. Oh, wow, just like in Buddhism, this and this and this. I remember when I was a young girl, playing dolls with my neighborhood friend, and she was of a different religious faith, and we were talking about dinosaur bones, and she said, God just put those there to test your faith. Dinosaurs didn't really exist because the earth isn't that old. And I said, what? My dad was big into paleontology. I'm like, that can't be true. And so I realized that in order to believe certain religious philosophies, you had to, in some cases, ignore certain aspects of science. And so I remember after my friend went home, I went to my mom and I said, Mom, I practice Nichiren Buddhism. What parts of science do I have to ignore in order to practice? And she said, nothing. She said, in fact, Buddhism is ahead of science, and science is trying to catch up. But she said, she also very sternly looked at me. She said, if there's any time that something is not common sense, you have to question it. And so it was from that perspective I went to school and really questioned lots of different things. And I feel really fortunate that I was born into this practice, because I might still be waiting to see the math before I got so many benefits in my life. So I'm very hard-headed that way. Anyway, thank you. Thanks for letting me be here today.
Oh, thank you so much, Cindy. Thank you all so much. I was it was interesting to watch you talk about like seeing the connections, like writing in the margins, for example, and everyone's head went, oh yeah. You're clearly like all on the kind of same page around like these connections and really feeling like, oh yeah, I remember those experiences studying these things. I think, you know, now we can kind of dive in a little bit the connections between Buddhism and space. Something that I, of course, had shared with you all earlier is that, you know, I think sometimes there can be this misconception that like, okay, if you're science minded, then there's no way you can be spiritual in any sense. Or if you're spiritual, you practice Buddhism, then like, you know, you can't believe in science, or there are aspects that you know, just have to say like, that doesn't really, you know, away with that part, right? So I'm wondering, of course, what all of you would say to that.
I think for me, just after going to school and just learning, I kind of ask, why would you not practice Buddhism? You know, because especially when you get into aspects of quantum mechanics or cosmology, where you start to, there's that gray line that starts to teeter on, you know, religious philosophy and science. And of course, that line gets pushed and changed and, you know, as we learn more and more and get more data. But because things are so consistent, there's absolutely a mystic quality to life. You know, there's, you know, one small example of one of those in the margins notes, you know, was just learning about quantum entanglement, right? Where you have a particle that has a certain, you know, superposition and it's tied to another particle. And as soon as you look at the spin of one, it determines the spin of the other, even if they're light years apart. You know, Einstein called it spooky action at a distance, meaning it defies c. It defies the limit of the speed of light. As determined in the special theory of relativity. So there's something instantaneous about cause and effect, in my opinion. You know, it's consistent in that sense with Nichiren Buddhist philosophy. When we lost contact with our spacecraft, you know, I called my mom. I said, Mom, you got to chant. And so she started chanting right away. And she said, I'm going to chant. She said, I understand C, because she got, you know, she did college astronomy when she came to the States. And she said, I know what C is, but I'm going to chant that my Nam-myoho-renge-kyo reaches that spacecraft in an instant. Right. And there's something to be said about that. You know, there's a there. And so, you know, I'm not seeking to prove Buddhism. You know, proof of Buddhism is based on actual proof by practicing. But it is fun to look at so many consistencies about Buddhist philosophy and basic science that I think is just fascinating.
I think it's a great point that you make, that it's not like, oh, I'm using science to prove Buddhism, because the proof of Buddhism is in our daily lives. Does it actually work? You know, and
Exactly.
We all know because we practice it works, right? But to your point, seeing those consistencies is like really, exciting, I guess I would say. What do you guys think?
Yeah, you know, I was going to piggyback on Cindy there. You know, she that was one of the things me and you, Cassidy, had talked about earlier, quantum entanglement. As you said, we're not here to prove Buddhism. We see that in our daily lives. But when I see the physics of, you know, like quantum mechanics, and I see Buddhism, they go like, they fit together. It's like, oh, so that's how it works. Because a lot of times your brain kind of goes, well, I'm chanting and I want to overcome this problem. How's that work? You know, it worked. How's that work? And, you know, those of us who dabbled in, and I'm not a physicist, by the way, I'm just an engineer, who kind of look into this and you know, have some understanding of it. It's like, well, that could be, you know, kind of how it works. We always say the Japanese term, the eshofuni, a person in their environment. And so as we change our lives, our external environment also changes. And so I believe, you know, that really, you know, you start to look in, you know, physics, and you start looking into, you know, especially quantum physics and stuff like that. You know, why not? You know, there's one good way to say, oh, well, that's how it works. But that's what I love about, you know, Buddhism so much, is when you start to look at Buddhism and look at science, boy, there's so much side by side, you know, that goes along with the two. It just, you know, totally blows your mind when you see a lot of this. I think it was Daisaku Ikeda, you know, he said, you know, I think somebody asked him, well, what about some science question? And he goes, well, it's whatever science decides. Buddhism isn't here to determine science. What is science saying about this issue? That's what Buddhism believes. Buddhism, we're not here to make science. We're not here to prove science or anything like that. What does science say about that? And that's what Buddhism believes. So I don't really see this conflict in here.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I was just like thinking, oh, both Roger and Cindy, you grew up practicing Buddhism and then went into science and started discovering, oh, these things are totally like, yeah, connected with what I understand and know from Buddhism. And then Neha and T, you didn't start practicing until, a little bit later. So I'm wondering, like, for you, were you already science minded and then learning about Buddhism was like, oh, that connects with science, like the opposite way?
Maybe I can start because like when Cindy mentioned about quantum physics, it's actually something that I come to realize later. So because like in school we learn about classical mechanics first before we learn about quantum mechanics, and classical mechanics is essentially what it means. I mean the crux of it is that as long as you know the position, and then you know the velocity or speed, and then you know that they are like acting force, then everything is already set. It's deterministic in the sense that once all the parameters are set, then it just runs. There's no room for other things for you to do. And that determinism is actually quite discouraging to me. Like as I study science more and more during my school years, I feel like there's no room for me to have a free will. There's no room for me to feel anything. The fact that I feel anything is because atom molecules chemical reactions dictate me to do so. So then what's the meaning of like happiness? What is the meaning of this and that? But then I feel that the happiness that I have is real. I want it to be real. I want it to come from me. It's not come from the fact that there's some million trillion years ago interaction make me feel that way. So there's no room for that kind of like a self in classical mechanics. But then when I come to learn more about quantum mechanics, the fact that there's some room of uncertainty, and the fact that consciousness might influence how uncertainty come to certainty, then there's a room for individual, there's room for self. And actually that's one thing that I come to learn, that actually science have room for religion, for Buddhism, for spirituality to come in. We don't have to give up our own free will or the fact that we have life in that sense. But one thing that I would like to share, and then I feel that is important too, is that actually science is a belief system. Sometimes people thought that science is some truth that is indisputable and then it's always there. Actually, in a strict sense, we never say that anything can be true, unless it's in the realm of a theoretical logic. Then you can say something is true, tautology. But in science, we just come up with a hypothesis, and then we keep doing experiments, and then we say that we haven't seen evidence to disprove the hypothesis yet. So in the sense, you cannot say that it's true, but you can just say that I haven't seen evidence to prove it's false. So and then I feel that because of that, I feel that Buddhism is also a belief system. So it's about whether you want to believe and then see to yourself, what does it mean to you? How does it impact to your life? So and actually in Nichiren Buddhism, we open for doubts, we open for questioning and so forth, and it's a part of the process, and it's a healthy process that we believe in it, and then we doubt sometimes to kind of refresh our own determination, our own conviction, and do it again. And I feel the science is the same, if we just stick same thing as classical versus quantum mechanics. If we just believe that classical mechanics is the end, then we would never discover anything else. So
Actually, I agree with that, because I think we all can come to this conclusion that science is not just be it end all, it's ever changing. I think scientists are constantly trying to prove theories. Isn't that true? There's a reason why we keep on doing missions and we keep on exploring the universe. Of course, it's hugely vast, right? But we keep digging deeper into how this works. Why does this work? And as scientists explore things, they come up with new theories, they come up with new ideas that they are trying to prove. Now, because of that, because science, we say that it's never like be it and all, it's ever changing. On the other side, Buddhism, right, comes from a very long history of studying consciousness. Well, it's through meditation, through, philosophical inquiry, right? But we also understand that things are constantly changing. We who practice Buddhism know 3,000 realms in a single moment of life. So how can we ever pinpoint to one thing? We cannot. And just like that, it was mentioned here, Buddhism already has this philosophical nature to it, but science is trying to catch up. How I take that as, we're exploring the nature of consciousness. Both Buddhism and science were questioning consciousness. And that's I think science is trying to explore that actively, as whether it's through psychology, whether it's through, neuroscience. What is the potential of all of this? How can we transform? And Buddhism already has the answers to that. It's not, again, like I said, not that Buddhism is trying to teach science, but it's trying to coexist. I am trying to understand who I am. But what am I made up of? I'm made up of atoms. Isn't that true? We're all made up of atoms. We're all made up of, these things or matter. But science is trying to put that through evidence, prove that through evidence, constantly questioning that. Buddhism, we prove that through our daily lives. Science is trying to bring that in together, fit in that puzzle, basically.
Oh my gosh. I'm like, I just want to say, as somebody that like has zero science background, one, you're all like really lovely at explaining things. I feel like I'm like glued to a really fascinating TV show or something. This is really fun. But Neha, you mentioned the concept 3,000 realms in a single moment of life. And of course, that's a complex concept, but this can kind of maybe move us into now talking about different Buddhist concepts specifically, or scientific concepts, and how they really connect or explain each other or reinforce each other. So I don't know if anybody wants to explain 3,000 realms in a single moment of life, at least a very brief explanation, and maybe how that connects to how you could understand it through the lens of science.
I don't want to dive too much into the detail. It's quite complex, but I think one idea is kind of 3,000 realm is almost represent all possibilities that it can happen, or infinite variations. And then when we say single moment of life, it's kind of this moment. It's kind of the innermost determination that you have right now can open you to limitless possibilities. And I feel that, back when I mentioned about the idea of classical mechanics versus quantum mechanics, and, deeper and deeper into the realms of the unknown, when you look into the innermost thing that you thought that is the tiniest place, actually there's a lot of possibility that can happen. And I feel that's kind of the science say. What science says support that. But I think what science hasn't said much is about your own determination. It's kind of the fact that, of course, there are 100 millions, trillions of possibility. You are the one who decide. You are the one who, make that innermost determination to move forward and then open the most value-creating way on your life. I think that's the Buddhism, push it a little bit further from that, theoretical concept of million possibilities. You choose. Essentially, you choose. I'm the one who choose my path.
My colleague at work mentioned something that reminds me about what T just said. So we were waiting for a phone call about some funding issues. I knew it was either going to be good or it was going to be bad, and I knew it was going to be bad. But, my colleague called me and said, okay, he's going to have this phone call. Will I go chant, about the situation before he makes this phone call? And I said, okay, I'm going to chant Nam-myoho-renge-kyo. And I said, but, the decision has already been made. You just don't know what it is yet, right? And he said, Cindy, you know Schrodinger's cat, right? Which is an analogy used in quantum, you know, about a cat in a box, and either the cat is dead or alive. You don't know which until you open the box and see it. And that kind of refers back to, you know, when you look at a particle, and when you go to observe either its location or its momentum, you actually determine either where it is or how fast it's moving. Anyway, he said, chanting Nam-myoho-renge-kyo is like Schrodinger's cat. It's deterministic. You're the one determining whether the cat's alive or dead. He doesn't practice this Buddhism. He has just seen me chant for things at you know, at work, and he's seen it work over and over again. So I was chanting while he was on the phone call, and he really reminded me, yeah, you know, like T said, I'm the one that determines the outcome no matter what. And so after the phone call, when he called me back, the news was, to me, mediocre, but he took it in a very positive way and said, wow, I'm so happy we got this, and now we're going to do this and this and this and this. And it did end up being a positive thing later. Wow. But it was my short-sightedness that already determined before chanting Nam-myoho-renge-kyo how it was going to be, and I had to be kindly reminded by someone who was just watching this practice work from a distance, you know, remind me about the deterministic aspect of chanting Nam-myoho-renge-kyo and how powerful it is. So I really appreciate him for that.
Wow. That's so wild. That's so cool. I was really curious how you think like Buddhist philosophy informs or can inform decision making about like space exploration. So in more of like a practical sense, you know, in Buddhism, we really talk about creating value. And so I'm wondering like what your guys' thoughts are in terms of like what Buddhism can offer.
Well, you know, I'll say this: when Apollo 11 went to the moon, on the side of the leg of the limb was the plaque that says, you know, we come here for all mankind, or for humankind, and as much as, you know, Buddhism informing how we, you know, go into space, I believe we kind of have to maintain that philosophy that space has to be someplace where we can have peace. But right now, we're having a lot of conflicts with other nations, yet we have the International Space Station where those people we're having conflict with are actually there, that we can work with them. You've got to have this ability to work together. You kind of have to, you know, tear down these borders and everything when you're in that kind of a situation. As Buddhists, I hope we can really continue to, you know, push that, you know, process forward, that space needs to be peaceful. I think we need to really, you know, maintain that initial spark that we had when we went to the moon, that this isn't, I come here to claim this for us. I think we need to maintain, you know, a peaceful space. Otherwise, you know, I think it becomes very difficult to work in space.
Echoing along the same lines as Roger, because I have a military background and that's what I'm coming from, something that Buddhism teaches us is world peace. Unfortunately, the military sees it as, you know, people being different entities based on where they come from. And as, you know, I think what we all need to gear towards is we have to protect people, regardless of where they come from, regardless of what country. What I'm seeing a lot is the reason why we're launching all of these satellites or assets into space is that we can provide more resources for our warfighters. I think coming from also a Buddhist background, and when we're focusing on a world peace philosophy, is that something I have conversations about somewhat with my coworkers, that, you know, they have friends in different countries who are also on the defense side of their own country. We have to combine and come together to say that space is slowly becoming another territory where people are, you know, trying to territorize their own aspect. No, this belongs to this country, and I'm not going to name any country in specific, but, you know, characterizing that. I think we need to learn that from Buddhism, that we have to protect the space as a world, as a, you know, because otherwise we're always going to stay divided. We're always going to stay divided on land, in water, as we are today. Space is going to soon become that too, but that's something that we as Buddhists have to expand on. And now we actually can become one when it comes to space. I think So that's something that Buddhism provides, is that I think we can slowly, make them understand or bring to the military side of things.
And T, do you want to go? I saw
Oh
you.
yeah, yeah. So it's just like I did like we didn't plan this, but because Roger mentioned about Apollo, I keep this emblem. I'm not sure if you can see from here. It's Apollo 11, and yeah, I just came to learn. If you look at the eagle, they actually hold an olive branch, and actually that's a symbol of peace. And this is not like it's not accident, actually like the astronaut among three of them, the Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong and Michael Collins, they actually designed this emblem, and then they add this olive branch to represent that we come here for peace. And I feel that that's like inherent in the nature of the space exploration. I think like when people talk about like why we go to space or do space exploration, I mean, in the perspective of like Buddhism, we also talk about the idea of like good or benefit, where like there's definitely benefits that we get out of like a space exploration, like the fact that we have satellites out there today, the improvement of telecommunications, the medical procedures that we have. Actually, we learn a lot from those space exploration. And even like in the longer perspective, people also mention about the fact that Earth is always going to be under threat of the meteors and comets. It sounds like it's not so common, but actually if you look in the longer perspective of time, actually we are bombarded by meteors and comets. And even like 100 years ago in Russia, there's like, like a comet that hit, and it create like, like atomic bomb like environment where, like there's a lot of dust and actually, like the land got perished and so forth. So then, the increasing the chance of like our civilization to continue on, that's also, like in terms of like the good or benefit that we can get out from the space exploration. But in the aspect of value creation, like we talk about another idea of beauty, like the fact that like the endeavor of human to explore, that's like the beauty that we can see from the exploration. And the fact that we can look back to Earth, the fact that we can look at to Earth to see how precious our home is also, like the beauty of this endeavor to explore space. And actually in the same emblem, the Apollo 11, you see like the bird is like, on the moon. Actually in the background, there's a crescent Earth. So the fact we go to the moon, we see the Earth as a precious home. And actually, I would like to read one thing from our life mentor, Daisaku Ikeda. He has a dialogue with an astronomer, Wickramasinghe, and then they discuss like why we do space astronomy and so forth. And yeah, I feel that this is like something that it hit me. Ikeda said, "The universe encompasses dreams and adventure, eternity and the expanses of a boundless life. Universe is also a world of wisdom for human beings investigating its wonders. Human state of life expand infinitely when they contemplate the universe, and feelings of compassion for the irreplaceable earth and for humanity are stimulated. In addition, their sense of human being as a child of the universe and as a microcosmos deepens. If humanity would like to reflect on the history of Earth and looking upward in the immense heavens, I'm certain that it would recognize the foolish of its narrow mind quarrels and the importance of peace. If people proceed with respect for the majesty of eternity, they would come to understand the utter futility of things like confrontations among their small egos. From this perspective too, I feel astronomy and the study of the universe have a noble educational role to play in directing and awakening humanity to its common goal." So yeah, that's what I feel like why we would like to explore space.
I'll share too. Thank you. I'm so amazed. I think as a species too, we're just hardwired to look up and wonder, where we came from and where we're going. And I think that's such a unifying concept globally. You know, people in every country for ages and millennia have been looking up at the sky at night and asking those kinds of questions. And so I think the fact that now we have the technology to start to scratch that surface, you know, and figure those things out is something that naturally unifies the world, just as a human being. And I think, you know, Cassidy, when you said, well, does Buddhist philosophy apply to space exploration? I think anywhere there's people, Buddhist philosophy applies. I met Neil Armstrong on a couple different occasions, and he is such a humble, quiet, down-to-earth guy, you know, and he's probably one of the most well-known people on the planet, but his ego is just so, it's so refreshing. You know, he's very quiet-spoken, and that kind of, I'm so glad it was him that stepped off, you know, the limb, because he just represented, you know, that quiet confidence and exploration and desire to create value. You could feel it from him that he really was of service, you know, to the country and to the world. It wasn't about him. And so I think in any field of endeavor, you know, having that kind of magnanimous character in terms of when you're trying to create value is really powerful, you know, because otherwise many times it becomes about you or your lesser self, or, you know, trying to show that you're better than someone else. And at that point, there's no wisdom, there's no value anymore, you know. So President Toda, the second president of the Soka Gakkai, and I'm paraphrasing, but he had said, there's no value in knowledge without wisdom, right? It's about wisdom, is about how do you apply that knowledge. So I think that's a valuable thing for all of us to really, you know, think about. And in anything that we do, you know, whether we're in space or we're in medicine or we're taking care of the home or raising children, whatever role, every single person is so important, especially when they're doing it out of sense of wanting to make the world a better place.
Wow. I feel like I'm getting this like sense that we all have a very poetic spirit, like in the ability to be able to like really feel an openness to like the expansiveness of the world and like the beauty in that. It's really, very moving for me, honestly. It's really incredible. Something I was thinking about and listening to you guys is, you know, we haven't mentioned yet that like our Buddhist practice is chanting. So, you know, all of us chant Nam-myoho-renge-kyo every day. And so I'm curious, you know, it's some folks might say like, yeah, it's really wonderful to have those ideals, but when it comes to the reality, you know, how do we actually bring out the wisdom rather than just acting on knowledge? And, you know, I imagine for many folks, for me included, it's a real challenge. So I don't know if any of you have anything that you'd want to speak to in terms of like chanting and being able to cultivate wisdom. But I just wanted to, bring that up.
I think Cindy mentioned a little bit about Neil Armstrong, that, you know, he is such a humble person and don't get swayed by, you know, the fame, the success. I came across a book, I already forgot the name, but actually this person researched, many life of astronauts who went to Apollo missions. And my first thought is that I thought that like all astronauts are the same. They have to be hard, you know, like kind of like, you know, the strong person who, you know everything, you know, smart, you know, athletic and everything. So then I have this kind of like a uniform thinking that kind of like, if every astronaut is the same, they are perfect. And then, you know, then they move on in their life, they become successful. And actually this book that mentions about, you know, how many like astronauts end up being in different places in their life. Let's say, for example, like there's one astronaut who, you know, after going to space, they become super spiritual and become a minister. Wow. Another astronaut, you know, become like, you know, caught up in like, you know, power and become like politicians. There are astronauts who, you know, like, you know, become alcoholic because they cannot cope with the fame, and then the loss of fame. Actually, the fame fades away. So then I feel that in this topic of knowledge and wisdom, I feel that, of course, you know, people who become an astronaut, they all have knowledge, I feel. they have so much knowledge. But then the wisdom comes from the fact that how can you eventually live my life and our life. And then I feel that that's kind of like the lesson that I learned from like space exploration, and then come back to my practice too, that, you know, of course, you know, I want to be, you know, like smarter, I want to be, you know, physically stronger and so forth. But eventually I want to have a happy life. I want to have a contributive life. And I think Buddhism brought back, you know, that wisdom, not just like the knowledge.
And knowledge alone can't, like, having a bunch of knowledge, right, can't just make us happy, right? Happiness is like a state of life. Thank you for sharing that, T.
I want to mention something that Neha said. She said that, you know, we're all atoms, right? And, you know, Carl Sagan said, basically he said, we're the stuff of stars. To quote him directly, he said, the cosmos is within us. We are made of star stuff. We are a way for the universe to know itself. And I think that's so profound. And literally we are the stuff of stars, right? I mean, you know, when you have a star that it's undergoing nuclear fusion, burning hydrogen, and when it supernovas, you have all these heavy elements that come out, you know, like iron. The iron in our bodies came from a supernova, literally. You know, so when you go to the grocery store to buy iron supplements, you're actually buying stardust. And so we have this really deep connection with universal phenomena itself. There's also a concept in science called zero-point energy, where even if you took something and put it in a vacuum and cooled it to 0 Kelvin, as low as temperatures you can get, there's still a vibration there, which there really shouldn't be technically, but there is. They're finding that there is. And so that means, you know, you can't have, you know, like Einstein said, energy is not created or destroyed. It merely changes form. And that is consistent with the Buddhist concept of birth and death, because they're both functions of life itself, right? So life is always there. It can never be zeroed out. It just changes form. And so our energy and our stardust, we also just change form when we pass. It's like, you know, you have an ocean, and the human being is like the wave that forms, and it travels across the ocean with its family of waves based on your karma. And then when it curls back in and goes back into the ocean, it doesn't disappear. It just goes back into that universal pool of energy. And it's just one more consistency that I've seen on a quantum level with how the universe works and how life and death, you know, the concepts are consistent with each other. And it's really exciting, I think, to see what kind of a close connection to universal phenomena we have directly.
Wow. Actually, yeah, so it's so mystic, Cindy. I plan to share like almost exactly the same thing. Wow. About the supernova and about something out of nothing. So maybe I can add another aspect about this idea of like we are the stars, we are all precious. Concept of like this kind of like the universal inherent worthiness or dignity is so highlighted in SGI Nichiren Buddhism. Like we believe that we are special, we all have this power to, you know, grow and become like beautiful in that sense. And throughout the history of astronomy, the way it starts is come from the religion almost. Like, you know, there's a concept of like something is perfect and something is imperfect. So the things that perfect is in the sky. The thing is imperfect is on earth. And those kind of like philosophy actually create quite a, you know, like a disturbance or like unhappiness in the society. And one story that I just learned and is quite ridiculous and actually is quite heartbroken at the same time. Throughout the history, you know, there are like people in the religion try to defend that the sky is perfect. You know, the earth, you know, is the center of everything. The motion of the stars need to be circular and so forth. And we cannot go up to the sky. That's the mandate of the religion back then. I think maybe you might came across Johannes Kepler. He's one of the scientists who actually like you do the math and then found out that the orbit of the planets is actually elliptical, not necessarily circular. And he wrote a science fiction about going to the moon. That's something that I learned new, and then I found that was fascinating. The sad story is that the religion authority used that as an excuse to punish his mother from being a witch. And I feel like, what? Like, the fact that we talk about going to the moon, like having wonderful journey to explore, space exploration, back then is prohibited. And it's become a cause to persecute, like a woman who have nothing to do with it. And I feel that that's like absurd. So we come very far from that. The fact that like we now have science, and actually now that we have like a wonderful philosophy like SGI Nichiren Buddhism that talks about the equality, the non-hierarchical way that we can embrace. The fact that the star is not so perfect, and actually we are worthy as the stars in the sky. I feel that's so liberating that we have such a philosophy in our own life.
Share. This is just a little bit that came into my mind. Nichiren Buddhism talks about transforming one's life, but also focuses on how to lead a happy life, how to become happy in this lifetime. I'm thinking about science on a mission to say that there is life outside of Earth, that there is life outside what exists here, as we say, and as we know, constant missions are going on different planets to prove that there's life outside. Don't we all come to that same conclusion about life, about that seed that we all talk about, right? We say that what exists within us, and we all say that this Buddhism exists in everybody's life, or Buddhahood exists in everybody's life, regardless of your background or who you are. At the same time, I'm thinking, well, that's what science, when they're trying to see if there's life that can grow or can life exist, science is never rejecting that idea. Science is always going to be proving that, yes, life exists outside of Earth. It just makes me feel that, coming back to the concept, Buddhism already says that. As studies in Buddhism, we are already aware of that. And science is just trying to align with with that same concept. Buddhahood lies outside of Earth. Buddhahood lies in the light outside of Earth. That just came to mind. And I think that's very, very fundamental to both science and spirituality. Very fundamental.
As Nihon, as T was saying, life is precious, but my goodness, it wants to sprout up everywhere, in the universe. And to be able to look at that, and one of the things I love doing, I like to pull down the Webb telescope images, and you can take a look at these deep star fields and everything out there, and all of these points of lights. And when you start to zoom in on them, because it's such high resolution, you can see that these points of lights aren't stars; they're actually other galaxies. And inside of these other galaxies are these other solar systems and stuff like that. And you start to wonder, my goodness, what kind of life would be there? And so you realize that the universe is quite large. We kind of want to think to ourselves, we're kind of unique, and maybe our ego gets in the way sometimes of that. But when you look at this, it kind of puts you into more of a perspective that the life that we have here is quite precious, as T was saying, and we really have to take care of that. It seems that where we go to look for this life, we tend to find, if not the life itself, or some sort of it, or some function of it, we find remnants. Like on Mars, we said, we have these little pebbles. Well, that means there had to have been water. That was the only place these type of little pebbles form. Well, if there's water, then there probably was some sort of life form at some time of that water. Granted, it's not Mars invasion that we see on TV, but hey, everywhere this life really wants to form, and it just, and I'm not trying to say, well, it's everywhere, so life ain't so precious. Life is precious. You have to really take this life we have here on Earth very, very seriously. It is very precious for us to maintain that.
Wow. You guys are really converting me into somebody that's excited about space. My wife is going to be really happy about that because she always tries to watch documentaries with me. And I'm like, no, it's really stressful. But like hearing you guys, I'm like, wow. Like, especially thinking about the preciousness of life, it just makes me feel like a sense of awe rather than feeling like afraid. One question I had, maybe in light of this sense of like awe or unknown, we've been talking a lot about the connections between Buddhism and science and which things can kind of are in conversation with each other, but we've also talked about like where science is not yet caught up. And so I'm curious, like what aspects of Buddhism do you feel like are ahead, so to speak? We talked about like this aspect of determination, and the power of your determination can create your reality, which science is maybe in some is making space for, but doesn't necessarily have like, this is like whatever theory.
Now, I was watching a science program quite a few years ago, and it was a series on one of the science channels. And they were talking about quantum physics, they were talking about string theory and everything. And, the moderator was asking the scientist on the other side, very, poignant questions about, well, what about this? And, where do you think that's going to go? And the scientist kind of stepped back and says, well, at that point, you've just entered the realm of philosophy. You need to ask a philosopher. And my head went, physics has gotten to a point where, we just don't know. Now he said, you've just basically entered the realm of philosophy. You've got to go ask a philosopher about that. We haven't got there yet. And I just found that just so, remarkable. And of course, every single day there's something new. Cindy was saying, you get that temperature down to where, movement doesn't stop. I've not heard that. That's new for me.
I think what's interesting to me also is in terms of where philosophy and science, where that gray line is. One is about the eternity of life and of the universe. And of course, we all know about the Big Bang. And there's theories that now after a Big Bang, where the universe is just expanding, everything is expanding from each other. So it's not like there's one thing and things are moving away from that. It's more like dots on a balloon. You blow up the balloon. Everything is moving away from each other. And at some point, there's going to be a big crunch is one idea. And then I remember when I was in school learning about, astronomy, some Indian philosophy hint that there might be an eternal series of big crunches and big bangs. In a way, like there's this natural heartbeat of the universe that just keeps, beating. And it's really fascinating to think about it. So, yeah, I don't think technologically we're there yet or cosmologically we're there yet. The more time that goes by and the more data we have, the more it does seem like the big, for a while, the big crunch was just kind of laughed at. Now, a lot of people thinking, well, this is probably going to happen. And now what's the next one? So things are moving in that direction, but we'll see.
Actually, the book that I quote earlier, the Space and Eternal Life, the dialogue between Daisaku, Ikeda, and Wickramasinghe, they actually discuss about this topic about the eternity of the universe. And then it sounds like right now we believe in Big Bang theory, where like the universe starts from this like infinitesimal point that have like the infinite amount or like large amount of energy and burst off. And then one of the evidence that people claim that this is like the evidence that Big Bang happened is actually the cosmic background radiation. So basically it's kind of like the remnants, it's kind of like there's a blast and then you hear this sound like peppering all over the universe. And the fact that it's throughout the universe, then people believe that it's come from a single point that blasts off and then you hear this noise. But then in this book, like they discuss the fact that you hear that background noise. Does it really mean that it's come from the fact that it starts from a single source? There might be some other possibility that can explain away the cosmic background radiation without Big Bang. So in a sense, it goes back to this idea that, like at this point, we come to believe that Big Bang is the solution to explain this. But it might not be the solution we don't know yet. It's like always like the idea of like science that we continue to push on. But one thing that interesting I read a while back is the idea that we have a universe is actually might not necessarily just like a universe. Like in the process of the Big Bang, or like in the process when, you know, there's a lot of like energy and then there's a lot of, you know, in the concentrated space, there's actually possibility that things can happen different from the starting point. And actually, I think Roger Penrose, like one of the physicists, like he mentioned about the fact that there might be like multiple universe occurring during that process. And even like some like catastrophic events in the universe can actually create a universe in the universe again. So it's kind of like fascinating, you know, how people can envision, you know, that like all the limitless possibility that we have. So even though like right now it seems that there's people tend to agree that like Big Bang theory is the correct one, is still there's some room for discussion about that eternity of like universe can be potentially possible.
Wow, it's really, so incredible. I want to bring us to our wrap-up question, if that's okay. Every episode, I ask people for a piece of advice. So I wanted you all to share advice for somebody listening that maybe doesn't practice Buddhism, but they're, you know, scientifically minded. They're curious about Buddhism. Why should they start practicing, or what can Buddhism offer them? You know, and how should they start?
I'd probably say, you know, don't worry about there being this conflict. If you're worried about, I'm into science and Buddhism, don't worry about that conflict. The conflict isn't there. I think what you'll find, as I think, hopefully you've heard in this podcast, that there is a lot of parallels between the two. If you want that hope, if you want that absolute happiness in your life, give it a try. Go back to science as in, well, how's gravity work? Well, if we never do the experiment to find out, you're never going to know. So you've got to do the Buddhist experiment. Go and give it a try. I think you find yourself that you're not gonna have this big conflict that maybe you think you do will have. And I hope we've kind of explained that here today, that there's a lot of this that does go really hand in hand. I think you're going to enjoy it a lot. So.
When you said, Cassidy, about somebody who's curious, curiosity comes from questioning and trying things. Science is about experimenting. Science is about, that's how we find the answers. We just don't leave it up to say, oh, it's magical. Neither is Christianity and Buddhism magic, and nor is science magic. They're all based on actual proof. Science, so is science, and so is the philosophy of life. Right. So I would say the same thing. Give it a try. If there's somebody who's believing in science, well, science is a continuity, and so is Christianity and Buddhism a continuity of your own life. So instead of seeing it as two different aspects, it's really it's one, because I'm applying all of these Buddhist concepts that we talked about here into when I go to work, into my relationships, into my family. I'm always thinking about, how can I transform my environment by changing who I am? And the same thing goes for science. I'm trying the experiments. I'm not stuck on, yep, I've experimented this and this is it. I am evolving. Science is evolving, and so is our human fundamental life evolving every single day. So just like to say that, just like Roger said, try it out.
Neha and Roger said, just try it. I think part of being in science is getting the empirical data. And when you chant Nam-myoho-renge-kyo, you're basically, you're getting that in situ, in the field proof that it works. And I think, like Neha said, it's not a magic lamp. It's about chanting Nam-myoho-renge-kyo and connecting your life with, your microcosm with the macrocosm, even though it can be overwhelming when you think about the vastness of our universe or multi-universes, and it gets bigger and bigger. We shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we are a part of that phenomena. Nam-myoho-renge-kyo is a function of life, human life, our lives too. It's not something outside of ourselves. So when we chant Nam-myoho-renge-kyo with the determination, I'm going to create value because of this problem, I'm going to do, what's called our human revolution. I'm going to create value no matter what situation is happening, and turn it into, a function of good for this world. Then you start to see things mechanized in your life in a very interesting way. So it is about responsibility. It takes a lot of courage many times to face whatever it is in our life, especially when something is clearly someone else's fault. And if they would just leave, everything would be okay. That person is there to help you chant Nam-myoho-renge-kyo, to raise your life condition and bring out that larger sense of self, to be able to have the strength to overcome based on what your actions and what your accountability is and how you can overcome it. And from there, you're the body and your environment is the shadow. The shadow will respond one way or another. So it's a very empowering practice. So we have to remember that when we look at the universe and say, wow, how amazing, we should say, I'm so amazing because we're the same. That's me.
I would like to share a story. I'm not sure if it's a real story, but I love it. So back in 1900s, people have difficult time to understand how the sun works. So basically, if you just look at the chemical reactions and do some calculations, the sun's supposed to just disappear a long time ago because in order to create that amount of life, it needs to burn itself so fast that it should be disappear. And then this scientist came up with the idea that actually it's not chemical reactions, it's a nuclear reaction. So he's so happy, and then he went out for a date. And then this girl said, wow, look at the sky. The stars are so beautiful. And then the scientist says, and I'm the first one who know how it works. So that's kind of the story. And then you might wonder how this is related to the advice to anyone who practice. I feel that, it's so wonderful, that scientist, figure out how the stars work, how it burns. But it's come from the fact that we see the stars. The fact that we decide to look up in the first place. If we want to choose whether we want to discover or we want to be able to see the beauty itself, I think first we should see the beauty itself. We should look up into the sky and embrace it. Then we come to want to know why it works. And I feel it's applied to our practice too, that first look up the sky, chant, and then see how beautiful it is. And then we are welcome to have you in our community and learn more how it works.
So I guess I'll tell a story too. When I was young, I was watching a TV show, and it was I don't know that it was Cosmos, but it was one like that. The narrator was at this lighthouse, big lighthouse, and he goes in the front door, and there's windows all the way around the lighthouse as you go up. And the first window said, this is what makes up life. And it was subatomic particles and quarks and the tiniest thing that we have yet to determine. And he had a picture of it, and then he walks up the staircase, and now here's an atom, and it has protons and neutrons and electrons, and it's made up of these things. And he keeps going up, and now you have single cell animals, and keep going up, and you have human life. And then it starts to get bigger. You have continents and ocean systems, and now you have the entire world. And now you have our galactic cluster. Now you have the entire universe. And then he goes up to the very top of the lighthouse, and the last window is boarded up. There's boards nailed to it, but you can see little bits of light streaming in between the slats of the board. He said, this one we haven't been able to open yet, but there's some, and I'm paraphrasing, I was little, but I'm paraphrasing. He said, there is some law of life under which everything functions, and we have yet to articulate that. And I watched that, and I was like, wow, he's talking about Nam-myoho-renge-kyo. And I was so excited, and I ran into the kitchen, and I told my mom, pulling on her shirt, Mom, they're talking about Nam-myoho-renge-kyo. They just don't know it, but I know it. And she looked at me, and I said, should I call him? She said, it's okay. You can just chant. I said, oh, okay. But that's always stuck with me. There is a law of life that we are also a part of, that this whole universe has this rhythm and this function. And so, it's one more consistency, in my view, about Nam-myoho-renge-kyo being this ultimate law of life, and this law of life that under which the entire universe kind of functions. And so chanting Nam-myoho-renge-kyo is our way of unifying with that. We already have it in us, but it's our way of harnessing, that universal phenomena. Buddhist philosopher Daisaku Ikeda said, the benefit of Nam-myoho-renge-kyo is literally the benefit of the entire universe. It is inexhaustible and it's limitless. When we think about the vastness of the universe, how big it is, I remember in school they would say, people would say, gosh, I feel so small when I think about how big the universe is. To me, because I practice this philosophy, I thought, wow, look how big I am. Look how big my life state is. That is a representation of me as a human being chanting Nam-myoho-renge-kyo. I'm so fortunate that I didn't wait to see the math, that I've been able to chant Nam-myoho-renge-kyo starting right away, and I will continue for the rest of my life, even while I continue to study and learn about universal phenomena, because I want to create value while I continue to learn.